Caleb Rourke pressed his dead wife's locket into the dirt beside her grave and made a promise he didn't know how to keep. 5 children. No harvest. A summer burning everything alive. Then she walked past his fence, Eleanor Voss, the widow who'd sworn off men, off hope, off second chances. He didn't ask her gently. He asked her the only way a desperate man knows how, with his whole broken heart on the ground. And what she said next changed the entire course of both their lives. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very last word. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Caleb Rourke buried his wife, the sun came up anyway. That was the thing that stayed with him, how indifferent the sky was about the whole affair. Rose gold and brilliant over the ridge, spilling across the dry summer grass, like it didn't know Margaret was gone, like it didn't know 5 children had gone to sleep with a mother and woken up without one. He stood at the grave long after Pastor Hewitt had said his words, and folded his Bible and shuffled back toward town. Long after his neighbor, old Jim Pratt, had put a hand on his shoulder and given it one firm, wordless squeeze. Long after everyone had gone. Just Caleb and 5 small figures standing behind him in the heat. He heard the youngest first, Clara, barely 3, who didn't fully understand what the wooden cross meant, but understood that her father's back was shaking. "Papa," she said. "Papa, your shoulders are doing the funny thing." He turned around. Clara had her fists pressed to her mouth, watching him with wide brown eyes that looked so much like Margaret's he had to look away. "I'm all right, baby," he said. The words came out even. He didn't know how. His oldest, Thomas, was 14, already trying to be a man about it, jaw-set hands jammed in the pockets of his church trousers. Beside him stood Ruth, 11, who had taken it upon herself to hold the hand of every younger sibling simultaneously, which was physically impossible, but she was attempting it anyway. Then 7-year-old George, who had cried so hard at the service that he'd given himself hiccups that hadn't stopped yet. And 5-year-old Abigail, who kept asking if Mama was cold down there. "She ain't cold," Ruth kept telling her. "She's with the angels. Angels don't get cold." "How do you know?" "Because I know." "But how?" "Abigail, I know." Caleb gathered them the only way he knew how, arms wide, pulling all 5 into his chest at once in a way that was clumsy and desperate and wholly inadequate. Clara grabbed a fistful of his collar. George's hiccups muffled against his ribs. He pressed his chin to the top of Thomas's head and felt the boy stiffen, still trying not to cry, still holding himself together out of some misguided sense that someone had to. "Thomas," Caleb said quietly, "you can let go, son." "I'm fine, sir." "I know you are, but you don't have to be. Not right now." A long pause. Then Thomas's shoulders broke, and the boy wept like the child he still was, and Caleb held him just as hard as he held the rest of them, standing in the summer heat beside a fresh grave in the dry Nevada ground, thinking that he had no earthly idea what came next. What came next, it turned out, was chaos. The kind of chaos a man couldn't prepare for, no matter how many sleepless nights he'd spent dreading it. Margaret had been everything that made the household run the meals. The mending, the scheduling of baths and lessons, and the delicate negotiation of who had wronged whom and what the appropriate consequence was. She had managed 5 children the way a river manages water, constantly in motion, knowing every bend, anticipating every flood. Caleb had provided the land, the livestock, the labor. Together, they had been a working machine. Without her, the machine fell apart in a matter of days. By the end of the first week, George had broken 2 windows. Abigail had cut her own hair with kitchen shears. Clara had stopped sleeping through the night. Thomas had disappeared for an entire afternoon and come back smelling like the river and saying nothing about it. And Ruth had tried to cook supper and set a dish towel on fire. The beans were either burned or raw. The laundry piled up in the corner of the washroom like a testament to everything Caleb didn't know how to do. He went to bed each night so tired his bones ached and woke before dawn with his heart hammering, remembering all over again. The land itself wasn't helping. Summer in the Nevada Territory was no gentle thing. The creek was running low. The east pasture needed fencing before the cattle drifted. He had hay to cut a roof section that had loosened in the spring wind, 2 horses that needed reshoeing. His hands were the only hands he had, and there were not enough hours. He was standing at the fence line one morning, second week of July sun, already vicious before 8 o'clock, trying to remember if he'd eaten anything since noon the day before, when he heard the wagon coming down the road. He recognized Eleanor Voss's gray mare before he recognized Eleanor herself. The widow who lived at the old Voss property 3 miles east, the place she'd inherited when her husband Douglas died of fever 4 winters back. Caleb didn't know her well. Nobody in Harlan Creek knew Eleanor Voss particularly well. She kept to herself, kept her land traded at Murdoch's store on Saturdays, spoke when spoken to, and not much beyond that. She was somewhere in her late 30s, younger than Caleb had expected when he'd first learned she was a widow. Composed, people said. Private. More than one man in town had called on her in the years since Douglas died, and not one of them had gotten past the porch. She pulled her wagon to a stop at his gate without being invited, which was the first surprise. The second surprise was the basket on the seat beside her. "Mr. Rourke," she said. Her voice was even, no particular warmth in it, no particular coldness either. Matter of fact was the word. "I brought a supper. Figured you were likely struggling." Caleb looked at this basket. He looked at her. He had a week's worth of pride and grief and exhaustion stacked up behind his breastbone, and he was one moment of genuine human kindness away from making an embarrassment of himself. "That's real decent of you, Mrs. Voss," he managed. "It's pot roast, and biscuits, and there's a jar of preserves in there for the children." She set the basket down on the gatepost without getting down from the wagon. As if she'd made a decision to help, and a separate decision not to get involved, and was honoring both simultaneously. "I heard the young one cut her own hair. Word travels fast." "It's Harlan Creek, Mr. Rourke. Word doesn't travel, it teleports." She picked up the reins. "I'm sorry for your loss. Margaret was a good woman." "She was the best woman I ever knew," he said, and that came out rougher than he intended. Eleanor Voss paused. Something crossed her face that wasn't pity. He was grateful for, that he'd had enough pity to drown in, but something more careful, more knowing. "Yes," she said quietly. "I know what that's like." She clicked her tongue at the mare and drove on. He told himself he wouldn't think about it. He had enough to think about. He thought about it anyway. Not romantically, he wasn't anywhere near that. He was still reaching for Margaret in the night, still turning to say something to her at the supper table before remembering. He was nowhere near thinking about any woman in any way. But he thought about Eleanor Voss the way a drowning man thinks about a piece of driftwood, not because he wanted it, but because it was there and he was going under. She came again on Friday. Same time, same matter-of-fact manner. A covered dish of chicken and dumplings this time, and a second jar of preserves because she'd noticed the first one disappear in 2 days flat. "You don't have to keep doing this," Caleb said. "I'm aware of that." "Then why?" "Because your children are hungry and you're running yourself into the ground." She said it without judgment, the way someone states a weather condition. "I have no shortage of food. My garden is more than I can eat. It costs me nothing, Mr. Rourke." He wanted to argue. He was the kind of man who'd been raised to stand on his own 2 feet, who'd never taken charity in his life, who felt the weight of receiving help like a stone between his shoulder blades. But Clara was standing behind him, holding his hand, and looking up at Eleanor Voss with those enormous brown eyes, and before Caleb could say another word, Clara said, "You smell like flowers." Eleanor blinked. It was the first time Caleb had seen her composure shift just slightly. "Lavender," Eleanor said after a moment. "From the soap." "Mama used lavender soap," Clara said. The silence that followed was the longest 3 seconds of Caleb's life. "Did she?" Eleanor said softly. Not a question, just an acknowledgement, careful and quiet. "Are you going to be our new mama?" Clara asked. Clara, Caleb started. It's all right, Eleanor said, though something had tightened in her expression. She crouched down slightly, bringing herself level with Clara. No, sweetheart.
This
I'm
story
just your
was
neighbor.
posted on the channel west
Oh,
of Betrayal,
said Clara.
Please do not
That's
repost
okay too.
it in any form.
Eleanor Voss stood back up, handed the dish to Caleb without quite meeting his eyes, and drove away faster than usual. He didn't sleep that night. He lay in the dark and listened to Clara fuss in the next room until Ruth went in and settled her, which she did with a patience and competence that broke his heart because she was 11 years old, and she shouldn't have to be managing her baby sister at 2 a.m. She should be asleep. He lay there and stared at the ceiling and thought about Margaret, and about the East pasture, and about the low creek, and about the way Eleanor Voss had gone still when Clara mentioned the lavender soap. He thought about what it actually meant, the arithmetic of his life right now. 5 children, 1 man, a summer that was only getting harder. Thomas knocked on his door just before dawn. "Pa," the boy said, standing in the doorway. Not a child's voice anymore, or trying not to be. "I've been thinking." "About what?" "About you." Thomas leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. His father's posture, people always said. His mother's eyes. "You can't keep going like this." "I'm managing." "You burned supper twice this week. The 3rd time was fine. The 3rd time was hardtack and canned beans." Caleb sat up. In the half-dark before dawn, he looked at his oldest boy and felt the specific grief of watching a child grow up faster than they should have to. "Thomas, this isn't your burden to carry." "You're my father," Thomas said simply, as if that settled it. "I reckon it is." Caleb rubbed his face with both hands. "What is it you're suggesting exactly?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, "Folks in town are saying, you ought to hire somebody, a woman to help with the house and the little ones. A housekeeper." "We don't have money for a housekeeper." "I know." Thomas paused. "I was thinking about Mrs. Voss." "Thomas, she's alone out there, and we know she's a decent cook." "Thomas, enough." "Pa." The boy took a step into the room. His voice was low and direct, and so much older than 14. "I'm not asking you to marry her. I ain't asking you to do anything. I just think—" He stopped, tried again. "The little ones need somebody, Pa. Ruth is wearing herself out. Abigail cried for Mama 3 times yesterday, and I didn't know what to tell her. Clara still ain't sleeping, and you—" His jaw worked. "You look like a man walking into a wall every single day." Caleb didn't answer. "I just think we need help," Thomas said. "That's all I'm saying." He left before his father could respond, which was the smart move, because Caleb didn't have anything to say. He thought about it for 3 days. He argued himself in circles. She'd already made clear she wasn't interested in anything beyond neighborly charity. She had her own land, her own life, her own carefully maintained distance from everyone in Harlan Creek. She was not a woman who wanted to be drawn into someone else's mess. That much was obvious. And his mess was significant. But on the 4th day, George fell off the fence. He'd been told 17 times not to climb and split his chin open, and Caleb stanched the bleeding with a dishcloth, while Abigail screamed in the corner, and Clara tried to help by pouring water on everything, and Ruth stood in the doorway looking at her father with an expression of pure exhausted helplessness that he recognized because he saw it in the mirror every morning. He got George bandaged, got Abigail settled, got Clara dried off, got Ruth to sit down and eat something. Then he stood in the middle of his own kitchen in the July heat and made a decision. Eleanor Voss was on her porch when he rode up, shelling peas by the look of it, a bowl in her lap, the work of a person who filled their time deliberately. She watched him come down her lane with an expression he couldn't quite read. He dismounted, took off his hat. He was aware suddenly of how rough he looked. Unshaved, sunburned, the particular worn look of a man who hadn't had a full night's sleep in 3 weeks. "Mr. Rourke," she said, careful. "Mrs. Voss." He held his hat in both hands. He'd rehearsed this on the ride over. None of the rehearsed words were anywhere in his head now. I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear me out before you answer. Her hands went still in the bowl of peas. All right. He took a breath. I can't do this alone. I know that now. I've got 5 children who need more than I'm capable of giving them by myself. And I've got a farm that's going to fall apart if I don't put my full attention on it, and I can't do both things at once and do either of them right. He looked at her. I'm not asking you for anything that doesn't make practical sense. You've got too much land for one person, and not enough reason to stay out here working it alone. I've got more reasons than I can count, and not enough hands. Eleanor said nothing. Her face was giving him nothing. He pushed through. I'm asking if you'd consider coming on as part of the household, to help with the children, to manage the house. I can pay you something, not much now, but... You're asking me to be a housekeeper, she said flat. Something about the flatness of it stopped him. He looked at her for a long moment. He was an honest man, and he'd always been an honest man, and something in the careful precision of what she'd said made him understand suddenly that calling it one thing when it was possibly another thing was not a kindness to either of them. He said very quietly, No, ma'am. I reckon I'm asking for more than that. The peas sat untouched. Eleanor Voss looked at him with those composed, measuring eyes. My children need a mother, Caleb said. The words came out rawer than he intended. And I've got nothing to offer you except a house full of need, and a man who's still half broke from losing his wife. He stopped. Started again. You've got a home already. I know that. I'm not a fool. But I'd like for you to think about whether what you've got out here alone is really what you wanted, or just what you settled for. He pressed his hat to his chest. Because I think you deserve more than settling, and my children deserve a fighting chance. And maybe, just maybe, those two things aren't as far apart as they seem. Eleanor Voss stared at him for a long, unreadable moment. Then she said, Get off my porch, Mr. Rourke. His heart dropped straight through the floor. Come back tomorrow, she said. I need to think. He put his hat back on. He nodded once. He walked back to his horse with the kind of careful dignity a man maintains when he's not entirely sure which way the verdict is going to fall. Halfway down the lane, he heard her call after him. Mr. Rourke. He turned. Eleanor Voss was standing at the edge of her porch bowl of peas, still in hand, the summer light falling hard across the set of her shoulders. Your youngest, she said. Clara. Yes, ma'am. Tell her the lavender soap was from a shop in Sacramento, in case she asks. A pause. I'll send some with you when I come. He looked at her. The light was brutal and honest, and it showed everything. When you come, he said. I haven't said yes, Eleanor Voss told him. But I haven't said no either, and in my experience, Mr. Rourke, those two things are not the same. She went back inside. Caleb Rourke rode home with 5 children waiting, and a summer burning all around him, and something he hadn't felt in 3 weeks rising cautious and fragile in his chest. Not hope exactly, not yet. But the beginning of the shape of it. Eleanor Voss showed up the next morning before breakfast. No warning, no wagon. She came on horseback with a single saddlebag over the mare's flank, and a look on her face that dared anyone to make something of it. Caleb heard the hoofbeats from inside the house and came out onto the porch with Clara on his hip and a pan of half-cooked eggs he hadn't yet figured out what to do with, and he stopped when he saw her. You said tomorrow, he managed. It is tomorrow, Eleanor said, swinging down from the saddle. Did you want me to leave and come back in 3 hours so it feels more official? No, ma'am. Good. She tied the mare to the post, came up the porch steps, and looked at Clara. Clara looked back at her with the solemn intensity only 3-year-olds can sustain. Then Clara reached out and patted Eleanor's cheek with one small hand, the way she did with animals she'd decided to trust. Eleanor went very still. She does that, Caleb said. I see that. Eleanor's voice was careful, but something behind her eyes had shifted just barely, like a door opening a crack.
This story was
She took
posted
the
on the
pan from
channel
Caleb's
west of
hand without
Betrayal.
asking.
Please do not
Go
repost
feed your
it
horses.
in any form.
I'll finish breakfast. Mrs. Voss, I haven't agreed to any terms yet. Terms, she repeated with a look that suggested she found the word mildly absurd. You asked for help. I'm here. The eggs are burning. Go feed your horses, Mr. Rourke. He went and fed his horses. When he came back, the table was set. The eggs were done properly. There was fresh biscuit dough in the pan. She'd found the flour on her own, found the lard, found the salt. And all 5 children were seated and eating with a focused quiet that Caleb had not achieved once in 3 weeks. Ruth was watching Eleanor with an expression he recognized as cautious hope, the specific look of a child who badly wants something, but has learned not to want it too loudly. Thomas sat at the far end of the table, with his arms crossed, watching Eleanor the way a man watches a card player whose hand he hasn't seen yet. Caleb sat down. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then George said, mouth full, "These biscuits are better than Pa's." "George," Ruth said sharply, "it's the truth." "Everything is better than my biscuits," Caleb said. "That ain't a high bar, George." Eleanor, standing at the stove, made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh. She cut it off before it arrived, but it had almost been there, and Caleb noticed and filed it away. Thomas waited until Eleanor had stepped outside to check on the mare before he turned to his father with the directness that had always been both his best quality and his most exhausting one. "What exactly did you say to her?" "I asked for help." "What kind of help?" Caleb met his son's eyes. "The kind we need." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "And what does she get out of it?" Thomas: "I'm not being disrespectful, Pa. I want to understand." The boy's voice was steady. "A woman like that doesn't do something like this for nothing. She's got her own place, her own way of living. She came over here before sunrise. That means she didn't sleep much last night, which means she was thinking hard about it." He paused. "What did you say that made her think that hard?" Caleb looked at his oldest son and thought that 14 was a complicated age to be old enough to ask the right questions, young enough that the answers could still wound you. "I told her the truth," Caleb said. "That's all." Thomas considered this. Then he uncrossed his arms, picked up his biscuit, and said nothing else. Which, for Thomas, was the closest thing to approval he offered. The terms, when they established them, were Eleanor's. That much became clear quickly. She had thought about it methodically, practically, with the precision of a woman who'd spent 4 years managing her own affairs alone, and had learned exactly how much she was worth. She would come each morning, leave each evening. She would manage the household, the meals, the children's education. She'd been a schoolteacher once before Douglas Voss, and the mending, and the laundry, and the 10,000 other tasks that had been silently killing Caleb's capacity to function. In return, he would send Thomas over twice a week to help with whatever heavy work her land required, and she would take 2 days a month, no questions asked, to herself. "Those 2 days are not negotiable," she said. "Understood. And I will not be talked about in town," she added, looking at him directly. "I know how it looks. I know what people will say. But I will not have my name used carelessly. If anyone asks, we have a practical arrangement between neighbors. That's all it is." "That's all it is," Caleb agreed. Something in Eleanor's expression suggested she wasn't entirely sure he believed that. Something in Caleb's chest suggested she might be right to be uncertain. But he said it straight, and he meant it as straight as he could manage, and she accepted it, and they shook hands on the porch in the morning heat like 2 people doing serious business, which they were. What nobody had accounted for was the children. Children, Caleb had long since learned, do not care about terms and agreements. They care about whoever is warm and present and willing to listen, and Eleanor Voss, for all her carefully maintained composure, was all 3 of those things. Once she stopped being a stranger and started being the woman who braided Abigail's hair and read to Clara after supper, and found George's missing boot under the porch without making a production of it. It was Clara who broke through first. Clara always broke through first. She was constitutionally incapable of holding back affection. By the end of the first week, she had taken to following Eleanor from room to room with the focused devotion of a duckling that has decided unilaterally on its mother. Eleanor bore this with the particular expression of someone being handed something they do not know what to do with, but cannot bring themselves to set down. Abigail was next. Abigail, who asked too many questions and had an opinion about everything, and had been her mother's most exhausting and beloved child. Abigail latched onto Eleanor over a conversation about wildflowers. Eleanor had been outside hanging laundry when Abigail came out with a fistful of whatever she'd picked from the edge of the yard, and instead of accepting them politely and going back inside, Eleanor had sat down in the grass and asked every one of their names. "I don't know all their names," Abigail admitted. "Then we'll find out together." That was it. Abigail was devoted from that moment forward in the consuming, slightly overwhelming way that 5-year-olds are devoted to people who take them seriously. George respected anyone who could beat him at something, and Eleanor beat him twice in a row at checkers without appearing to try, which inspired in him a deep and competitive admiration. Ruth was slower. Ruth had been holding this household together by will alone for 3 weeks, and she was not ready to surrender that responsibility to anyone, not easily, because surrendering it meant admitting she'd needed help, and admitting she'd been scared. But Eleanor didn't try to take anything from Ruth. She worked alongside her. She asked her opinion. She treated her like the capable, serious-minded girl she was, and Ruth, who had been treated as a miniature adult for weeks and desperately wanted someone else to take charge, finally exhaled. Thomas held out the longest. He was polite. He was cooperative. He did everything asked of him, and nothing more, and he watched Eleanor Voss with those measured, careful eyes, and he waited. Caleb wasn't sure what Thomas was waiting for. Eleanor, he suspected, knew exactly what Thomas was waiting for. She didn't rush it. She didn't court his approval. She simply showed up every morning and did the work, and let him draw his own conclusions at his own pace. And in this, she demonstrated a patience that Caleb found quietly astonishing. The morning Thomas came to her with a broken harness he'd been trying and failing to mend for 2 days was the morning everything shifted between them. He came into the kitchen where she was helping Abigail with her letters and set the harness on the table without preamble. "I can't get the stitching right," he said. Flat. No particular feeling in it. Eleanor looked at the harness. "Your mother teach you to stitch?" "Some." "Hold it like this." She showed him. "The angle matters more than the pressure. Most people push too hard and split the leather." She handed it back. "Try." He tried. It was better. "Again?" she said. He did it again. Better still. He didn't say thank you exactly. But when he left, he took the harness, and there was something in the set of his shoulders that was different from the rigid, watchful way he'd been carrying himself, and that evening at supper, he answered Eleanor's question about the south fence with 3 full sentences instead of 1, and that was Thomas's version of an open door. 3 weeks in Harlan Creek started talking. Caleb had known it would happen. Eleanor had known it would happen. Knowing didn't make it easier to stand in Murdoch's store on a Saturday morning and feel the particular silence that falls when people have been talking and stop the moment you walk in. Vera Hutchins was the worst of them, had always been the worst of them. The kind of woman who wrapped cruelty in the language of concern. She caught Eleanor at the store on a Tuesday, which meant she'd timed it had known Eleanor's schedule. "I'm sure you mean well," Vera said loudly enough that half the store could hear. "But people are starting to wonder, Eleanor, about what you think you're doing over there, about what he's promised you, because a woman of your age alone going to a widower's house every day." She paused for effect. "Well, it doesn't look right, and I'd hate for your reputation to be what suffers." Eleanor turned around slowly. Caleb was there. He'd come in behind her, had heard every word, and he watched Eleanor Voss stand up to her full height and look at Vera Hutchins with an expression of such complete and devastating calm that two people near the back of the store took a small step backward. "Vera,"
This story
Eleanor
was
said,
posted on the
"I
channel
appreciate
west
your
of
concern
Betrayal.
for my reputation.
Please do not repost
I'll be sure to
it in
worry
any
about it
form.
right after I've made sure 5 children have eaten." She turned back to the counter. "The flour, please, Mr. Murdoch." Murdoch got the flour. Vera Hutchins said nothing else. But when Caleb walked Eleanor out to her wagon, he could see the slight tension in her jaw that told him it had cost her more than she'd shown. "You didn't have to handle it like that," he said. "Yes," she said, "I did." She put the flour in the wagon. Women like Vera Hutchins only stop when they run into something they can't budge. You learn that early, or you learn it hard. She climbed up to the seat. "I learned it hard." He looked up at her. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "For putting you in the position." Eleanor looked at him for a moment with something complicated moving behind her eyes. "You didn't put me anywhere I didn't choose to go, Mr. Rourke." She picked up the reins. "That's what I need you to understand." She drove away, and he stood in the street and watched her go, and thought about what it meant, a woman who understood the cost and came anyway. A woman who'd been hurt before and came anyway. He didn't know what to do with that. He wasn't sure he was allowed to do anything with it yet. But it sat in his chest all the way home, warm and complicated, and more frightening than he'd expected. That night, after the children were asleep, he sat on the porch in the July dark and thought about Margaret. He did this most nights, talk to her in the privacy of his own head, in the specific way of a man who knows his wife is gone, but hasn't fully released the habit of her presence. He told her about Eleanor, about the biscuits and the lavender, and the way Clara had taken to following her around the house. He told her about Vera Hutchins and the flour. He told her about the thing Eleanor had said, that she hadn't been put anywhere she hadn't chosen to go. He sat for a long time in the dark. Then Ruth opened the screen door and came out onto the porch in her nightgown. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "I keep thinking," she said. She sat down beside him on the step, tucking her feet up under her. 11 years old, going on 40. "Pa, can I ask you something?" "Always." She was quiet for a moment. "Is Mrs. Voss going to stay?" "She's here every day." "That's not what I mean." Ruth looked at him with Margaret's eyes. She had Margaret's eyes, all of them did, but it was Ruth who'd gotten the particular directness in them. "I mean stay, really stay." Caleb was careful with his answer. "I don't know, sweetheart." "But you want her to." He didn't answer right away. Ruth waited. She had always been a patient waiter. "I want what's best for this family," he said finally. "That's not an answer." "No," he said. "It ain't." He put his arm around her shoulders. "What do you want?" Ruth was quiet for a long time. Long enough that a whippoorwill started up somewhere in the dark and then stopped again. "I want to stop being scared," she said. "That's what I want." Her voice was small, smaller than she usually allowed it to be. "Every morning I wake up scared that today is the day everything falls apart. That you're gonna get hurt or get sick, and there won't be anybody." She stopped, pressed her lips together hard. "When Mrs. Voss is here, it's the first time I stop being scared. I don't know if that's right or wrong, but it's true." Caleb pulled his daughter close and pressed his mouth to the top of her head. "It's true," he said, "and it ain't wrong." Ruth leaned into him. They sat for a while without speaking. Then she said almost to herself, "She looks at you sometimes, when you're not looking." He stilled. "What do you mean?" "When you're talking to Thomas or working with the horses. She looks at you like—" Ruth paused, searching for the right words. "Like she's surprised by something. Like she didn't expect you to be the way you are." Caleb didn't know what to say to that. "I just thought you should know," Ruth said. She stood up, kissed his cheek, which she didn't often do anymore. She was at the age of pulling away, so he held still and received it like the gift it was and went back inside. He sat on the porch for a long time after. 4 days later, Eleanor Voss arrived in the morning with a split lip and a careful story about walking into a doorframe in the dark. Caleb knew what a doorframe does to a face. This wasn't it. He didn't push. He brought her coffee and set it down without comment and went back outside to work because he understood instinctively that a woman like Eleanor would bolt from direct questions the way a wild thing bolts from a hand reached out too fast. But mid-morning, when they were alone in the kitchen and the children were in the yard, he set down the harness he'd been working on and said without looking at her directly, "You don't have to tell me anything." Eleanor kept her hands in the bread dough. "But if somebody is hurting you," he said, "I'd like to know." She was quiet for a long time, long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. "It wasn't anybody," she said. "It was a disagreement." "With who?" Her jaw set. "That's my business, Mr. Rourke." "Yes, ma'am, it is." He picked up the harness again. "I'll stop." Another long silence. "Douglas had a brother," Eleanor said. The bread dough got folded over once hard. "Frank Voss. He has opinions about the property, about what I should do with it, about who I should do it with." She didn't look up. "He came by yesterday evening." Caleb set down the harness. "Did he put his hands on you?" The silence was its own answer. Something very cold and very quiet settled into the center of Caleb Rourke's chest. He had learned the hard way over 14 years of fatherhood and one long marriage that the angriest he ever got was the quiet kind. The kind that didn't raise its voice. Eleanor. It was the first time he'd used her given name. He didn't plan it. It came out of the seriousness of the moment, out of something past formality. "That man comes near you again, I want to know about it." She looked at him then, really looked at him. And he could see she was doing what she always did, measuring, assessing, calculating how much she could trust and how much she could afford to lean. "You've got enough to manage," she said. Her voice was careful, but something underneath it wasn't. "I've got enough to manage," he agreed. "And you're part of what I'm managing now." He held her gaze. "That ain't a burden. I want to be clear about that. That is not a burden." Eleanor Voss looked at him for a long, unguarded moment. The composure didn't crack exactly. It was more that something beneath it shifted like bedrock settling. "All right," she said, quietly. He nodded. He picked up the harness and went back to work. But that evening, when Eleanor rode home, Caleb Rourke saddled his horse and rode in the opposite direction 3 miles north to where Frank Voss had a claim and a drinking habit and apparently a set of convictions about what widows owed the men who thought they owned them. He didn't know yet what he was going to say when he got there. He knew it would be said plainly, and he knew Frank Voss would hear it. Some messages didn't need pretty words. Some messages just needed a man willing to mean them. Frank Voss answered the door with a whiskey glass in one hand and a look on his face that said he'd been expecting company and wasn't afraid of it. He was a bigger man than Caleb had anticipated, broader through the chest, with the particular red-faced thickness of a man who drank consistently, but not quite enough to ruin himself. He looked Caleb up and down the way men do when they're deciding how seriously to take a threat. "Rourke," he said, not a greeting, just an acknowledgement. "Voss?" Caleb kept his hands loose at his sides. His voice was exactly the same temperature it always was. "I think you and I need to have a conversation." Frank leaned against the doorframe. "About what?" "About Eleanor." Something shifted in Frank's expression. Not guilt, nothing as clean as guilt, but a kind of wariness that told Caleb the man knew exactly what this visit was about and had decided already how he wanted to play it. He took a long drink of his whiskey. "Eleanor Voss is my brother's widow. What happens on that property is Voss family business. That property belongs to Eleanor, Caleb said. Your brother left it to her legal and clear. I've seen the deed filed at the county office. He hadn't, but he said it the way a man says something true, and Frank's jaw
This story
tightened,
was posted
which told
on the
him he'd
channel
landed
west
on
of the
solid
trail.
ground.
Please do not
What
repost
you've been doing
it
out
in any
there that
form.
ain't family business. That's harassment. And if you put your hands on her again, it becomes something else entirely. Frank pushed off the door frame. He was trying to use his size stepping forward to eat up the space between them, and Caleb stood his ground without shifting an inch. You got no standing here, Frank said low. You're not her kin. You're not her husband. You're just a broke dirt farmer with a dead wife and too many mouths. I'm a man telling you plainly, Caleb said, cutting through it. Leave her alone. That's all. Just leave her alone. You do that, and we never need to speak again. He paused. You don't do that, and I'll have the sheriff out here before your next drink, and I'll be right behind him. Frank stared at him. The whiskey glass turned in his hand twice. The calculation behind his eyes was visible whether Caleb was the kind of man who meant what he said. Caleb looked back at him with absolute steadiness and let him do the math. Get off my land, Frank said finally. Gladly. Caleb put his hat back on. Remember what I said. He rode home in the dark with his heart still hammering, and his hands finally shaking now that it was over and nobody could see. He wasn't a violent man. He'd never wanted to be. But there were things worth riding toward in the dark, and Eleanor Voss with a split lip was one of them, and he didn't regret it for a single moment. What he regretted was not telling her he'd gone. He told her the next morning. He waited until the children were outside and the kitchen was quiet, and he told her straight because she deserved straight. Eleanor set down the coffee pot very carefully. You went to see Frank Voss, she said. Yes. Without telling me? Yes. The silence that followed was not comfortable. Eleanor turned to face him, and the composure was all still in place. Every bit of it, but underneath it, he could see something hot and controlled that he recognized as real anger. I am not one of your children, Mr. Rourke, she said, each word precise. I do not need you to ride out in the dark and fight battles I didn't ask you to fight on my behalf. I know that. Then why? Because you weren't going to do it yourself, he said. And because you shouldn't have to. He held her gaze. I'm not trying to manage you, Eleanor. I'm not trying to take anything from you. I went because he put his hands on you, and that is not something I am capable of knowing and doing nothing about. That's not management. That's just... He stopped. That's just how I'm made. The anger in Eleanor's eyes was still there, but something else had come up underneath it, something she was working harder to keep down. Did he threaten you? She asked. He tried. Caleb. It was the first time she'd used his given name. She seemed to realize it a half-second after it came out, but she didn't take it back. Frank Voss is not a man who lets things go. If you've made an enemy of him, then I've made an enemy of him, Caleb said. I've had worse. You have 5 children. I know how many children I have. She pressed her lips together hard. He could see her cycling through responses and discarding each one. This was the thing about Eleanor, that he'd come to understand she was a woman who chose her words with surgical precision because she'd learned at some point that careless words cost you things you couldn't get back. You should have told me first, she said finally. You're right, he said. I should have. The admission seemed to take some of the wind out of her anger. She turned back to the stove. Don't do it again. I'll tell you first next time. There won't be a next time, she said, because I'm going to handle Frank myself. Eleanor. I said I'll handle it. She picked up the coffee pot. Sit down and eat your breakfast, Mr. Rourke. He sat down and ate his breakfast, but he watched her, and he could see the slight tremor in her hand as she poured the careful way she was holding herself together, and he understood that the anger was at least partly fear, and the fear was something she had been living with for a while, and that made him angrier at Frank Voss, than anything else could have. The twist came 3 days later, and it didn't come from Frank Voss at all. It came from a letter. Thomas brought it in from the road where the postwriter had left it, and he set it on the table in front of his father without a word, but with the look of someone who has already read the return address and made his own calculations. The letter was from a man named Gerald Price of the firm Price and Halloran Attorneys at Law based in Carson City. Caleb read it twice. Then he set it down and sat very still. The letter informed him in the careful language lawyers used when they wanted to obscure the actual blow that a lien had been filed against the Rourke property by the Nevada Territorial Bank for a debt of $432, a debt he had not known existed. A debt, the letter explained, that had been contracted 18 months prior. By Margaret. He read that line 3 times, sat with it until it stopped feeling like the wrong name in the wrong place. Then he read the rest of the letter. The debt was secured against the east pasture. If not paid in full within 60 days, foreclosure proceedings would begin. $432. He did not have $432. He did not have half of that. He barely had enough to get through the season. Thomas was still standing in the doorway. "Pa." "It's all right," Caleb said. The old reflex, the one he'd been using for weeks. "It doesn't look all right." Caleb folded the letter, put it in his shirt pocket, stood up from the table. "It's something I need to look into. Don't mention it to your sisters and brother." "You're not going to tell me what it is?" "Not yet." Thomas looked at him for a long moment with those 2 old eyes. Then he turned and went back outside, and the screen door closed behind him, and Caleb stood alone in his kitchen with the letter in his pocket and $432 of debt he'd never known about sitting on his chest like a stone. He didn't tell Eleanor either. Not that day. He rode into town the next morning and went to the bank before it was properly open, and waited on the steps until Emmett Dryden, the banker, the man Caleb had dealt with twice in his life and liked neither time, arrived and unlocked the door with the faint disapproval of a man interrupted in his routine. "The Rourke account," Caleb said before Dryden had even sat down. "I need to see the full record." Dryden's expression did the small practice thing it did when he was deciding how much to share and in what order. "Mr. Rourke, I'm sorry for your loss. Your wife was—" "I need the record," Caleb said. "Please." The record was worse than the letter. Margaret had been borrowing against the property in small amounts for nearly 2 years, 50 here, 70. There, never enough at once to seem alarming, all of it quietly accumulating. The loan notes were in her handwriting, her signature legal and clear. "Did she say what it was for?" Caleb asked. Dryden hesitated. "She mentioned medical costs. For one of the children, I believe." Caleb went very still. "Which child?" Another hesitation. "I believe it was the youngest, Clara." Clara, who had been born early and small, and had spent her first winter being carried back and forth to the doctor in Silver Ridge 20 miles each way. Clara, whose first year had cost them more than Caleb had known about, apparently because Margaret had handled it the way she handled everything she was afraid would worry him quietly alone, shielding him the way she always shielded him from the things she thought he couldn't carry. He sat in Emmett Dryden's office for a while without speaking. "Mr. Rourke," Dryden said carefully, "I understand this is a difficult—" "Did she come in alone?" "I beg your pardon." "When she took out the loans, was she alone?" "Yes, always." Caleb nodded. He stood up. He thanked Dryden in the flat, automatic way of a man operating on procedure, while the rest of him was somewhere else entirely. He rode home thinking about Margaret, not with grief this time, or not only grief. Thinking about the particular shape of her love, the way it had always turned outward toward him and the children and away from herself. The way she'd taken on $432 of debt alone, so he wouldn't lose sleep over it. The way she'd protected Clara's life without telling him it had a price. He turned into his own lane and saw Eleanor's mare at the post, and felt something complicated and enormous move through him all at once. Grief for Margaret, gratitude for Eleanor, The particular dread of a man who has just learned the ground beneath him is softer than he thought, and the knowledge that he was going to have to tell Eleanor because keeping it from her felt like a lie, and a lie to Eleanor Voss felt like a specific kind of wrong he wasn't capable of doing.
This story was posted on the channel
He told her
West
that
of
evening.
Betrayal. Please
The
do not
children were in
repost
bed,
it in
and
any
Eleanor
form.
was about to leave for home, putting on her coat in the kitchen doorway, and he said, "Can you sit down a minute?" And the tone of it made her sit without asking why. He told her about the letter and the bank and Margaret and Clara and $432. He told her all of it in the same flat, even voice he'd used with Dryden, which was the voice he used when he didn't trust himself to use any other voice. Eleanor sat across from him and listened without interrupting once. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "The East Pasture," she said. "That's what they've filed against. If they take the East Pasture, what does that do to your grazing? Leave it to Eleanor to go straight to the practical. Cuts my herd capacity by a third, maybe more. And the 60 days, when does that start?" Letter was dated the 14th, so we've got till mid-September. Eleanor put both hands flat on the table. She was thinking he could see it the way she worked through things methodical and thorough. "I have money," she said. "Eleanor, I have money saved," she said. "From the property from the years since Douglas died. I've been careful." She looked at him. "I can cover it." The refusal was so immediate and so complete it was almost physical. "Absolutely not." "Caleb?" "No." He leaned forward. "Eleanor, I asked you into this arrangement to help my family. I did not ask you to fund it. I will not take your savings. I will find another way." "What other way?" "I'll sell cattle." "You don't have cattle to spare and you know it." "I'll work something out with Dryden." "Dryden doesn't make deals," she said. "He makes transactions. There's no working something out with that man." She held his gaze with the directness that had unnerved him the first time, and now felt like one of the most steady things in his life. "It's a loan. Between us. Written down, signed with terms we agree on. No charity. Just two people working out a practical problem the most practical way available." "It's not practical," he said. "It changes things." "What things?" He looked at her. She looked back at him. And the thing he couldn't say, and she was pretending not to see, sat between them on the kitchen table like a third-person patient and waiting. "Everything," he said, quietly. Eleanor's breath came out slow. Her hand still flat on the table, pressed down slightly. "Maybe some things need changing," she said even quieter. The room was very still. Then Clara's voice came from upstairs, high and sudden. "Papa." The nightmare voice, the one that shot through walls and cut through everything, and Caleb was on his feet before it finished. He took the stairs two at a time. Clara was sitting up in her bed, sweaty and disoriented, reaching for something that wasn't there. "Mama," she was saying. "Mama, Mama." "I'm here, baby." He gathered her up. "I'm right here. I want Mama." Clara said, the raw, broken want of a child who already knows she can't have the thing she's asking for, which is the worst kind of asking. "I know," he said. "I know you do." He held her and rocked her in the dark. Her crying subsided slowly in the ragged stages of a child coming back from a nightmare, and he stayed until her breathing evened out and her grip on his shirt loosened, and she was asleep again. When he came back downstairs, Eleanor was still at the table. She hadn't left. She was sitting with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, looking at the grain of the wood, and she looked up when he came in, and her composure had shifted again, not broken, but opened the way a window opens on a hot night. "Is she all right?" Eleanor asked. "She is now." Eleanor nodded. Then quietly, "I used to do that. After Douglas died. Wake up reaching." He sat back down across from her. "How long did it take to stop reaching?" She thought about it. "About a year before my hands believed what my mind already knew." She paused. "But there's a difference between believing someone is gone and being willing to stop grieving them. Those are separate things." "Are they?" he asked. "Yes." She met his eyes. You can honor someone's memory and still keep living. Those aren't opposites. A pause. Margaret sounds like a woman who would have understood that. He looked at her for a long moment. Something about the way she'd said it, not reassuring him, not managing him, just stating something she believed to be true, and trusting him to do what he wanted with it. She would have liked you, he said. Margaret. She would have liked you quite a bit, I think. Eleanor said nothing, but the cup turned in her hands once, and she looked away toward the window, and when she looked back, something had settled in her face that hadn't been there before. Take the loan, she said. Think of Clara. He closed his eyes, opened them. I'll think about it. That means yes, Eleanor said. And for the first time in weeks, truly, the first time she smiled small and brief and real, like something she'd almost forgotten how to do. He almost said something then. Something he wasn't ready to say, and she wasn't ready to hear. He could feel it trying to come out of him, large and clumsy and premature, and he swallowed it back down with effort. But the next morning, when Eleanor rode up the lane in the early heat, she found a document on the porch table, a handwritten agreement terms and repayment schedule in Caleb's clean, careful hand, with a signature line and a blank space for her own name. And underneath it in the margin in smaller writing, "Thank you. For all of it. Not just the money." Eleanor stood on that porch alone for a moment holding the paper. Then she reached into her coat pocket, produced a pen she carried out of old schoolteacher's habit, and signed her name. She walked into the house, put the coffee on, started breakfast. As if she'd always been there, as if she intended to keep being there. From the barn, Caleb heard the stove lid clank and the sound of his children beginning to stir upstairs, and the particular quiet rhythm of a household that had found something close to its own heartbeat again. And he kept working with his hands and let it wash over him like rain on dry ground. Careful and grateful and terrified, and something else, something that had been gaining on him for weeks. Something he was going to have to name eventually, whether he was ready to or not. Outside, the summer burned on. And somewhere north of town, Frank Voss was reading a letter that Eleanor had sent, composed precise legal in its language and iron in its intent, and his hands were tight on the page. He hadn't expected that. He should have. Frank Voss didn't respond to Eleanor's letter with words. He responded with lawyers. 2 of them arrived in Harlan Creek on a Tuesday morning riding in from Carson City in a rented buggy with a leather satchel between them and the particular polished look of men who charged by the hour and enjoyed doing it. By noon, the whole town knew they'd gone directly from the hotel to the county records office, and by supper, Caleb knew what they'd been looking for. Thomas brought him the news. Thomas, who had quietly developed a network of information sources across town that would have impressed a general, appeared at the barn door while Caleb was working and said without preamble, "Frank Voss is contesting the deed." Caleb set down his tools. On what grounds? Saying the property was Voss family land before Douglas bought it, and that Eleanor only has claim to improvements, not the original parcel. Thomas leaned against the doorframe. Manny Driscoll's boy works at the records office. He heard everything. That's not how deeds work. I know that. But lawyers cost money whether they're right or wrong, and Frank Voss has got some. Thomas paused. He's also been talking, around town, saying Eleanor's behavior since Douglas died hasn't been, he used the word, appropriate. Another pause. He's been specific about what he means by that. The cold, quiet thing settled into Caleb's chest again. He's using us against her. He's using you against her, Thomas said. There's a difference. Because it's your name that makes it stick. Caleb stood very still for a long moment. Outside he could hear Abigail and George arguing about something inconsequential, their voices rising and falling in the way that meant nobody was actually hurt, but someone was working toward it. He could hear Clara singing to herself near the porch. He could hear Eleanor inside the house moving between rooms with that quiet, unhurried efficiency she brought to everything. Does she know? Caleb asked. Not yet, far as I can tell. He nodded. He picked up his tools, put them away properly because leaving things in disorder was not something he did even in a crisis, and then he walked back to the house. Eleanor was at the kitchen table, helping Abigail sound out words from her primer patient and clear one finger moving under each syllable. She looked up when Caleb came in, read his face immediately. She had always been able to read his face from almost the first week,
This story
which
was
still caught
posted
him
on
off
the channel
guard,
west
and said
of
to
Betrayal.
Abigail,
Please do
"Take
not
the book out to
repost
the
it
porch
in
and
any
practice,
form."
sweetheart. I'll quiz you in a few minutes." Abigail went. The screen door closed. Eleanor folded her hands on the table and waited. He told her. All of it straight, the way she'd always told him she wanted things. When he finished, Eleanor was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. He'd learned to count her silences. 4 seconds meant she was processing rather than reacting, which was Eleanor at her most formidable. "He's smarter than I gave him credit for," she said finally. "He hired smart men." "It won't hold up. The deed is clear." But something in her voice had shifted, a slight tightening beneath the composure. "It doesn't have to hold up in court to do damage. It just has to hold up in people's minds long enough to—" She stopped. "Long enough to make you look like what he's calling you," Caleb finished. She looked at him. "And you. I don't particularly care what Frank Voss calls me." "You should," she said, and it wasn't cold. It was worried, which was a different thing entirely, and somehow more unsettling coming from Eleanor than anger would have been. "You have children in this town. They go to school here, they'll grow up here. If Frank poisons enough people against you—" She stopped again, pressed her lips together. "This is what I was afraid of, that coming here would cost you something I couldn't pay back." "Eleanor." He sat down across from her. "You haven't cost me a thing." "Caleb, look at me." He waited until she did. "Before you came here, Ruth was running herself into the ground trying to be her mother. Clara wasn't sleeping. George had broken every window I own. Thomas looked at me every morning like he was waiting for me to collapse." He kept his voice even, kept his eyes on hers. "I was going under, and I was doing it quietly, which is the most dangerous way to go under because nobody throws you a rope if they can't see you drowning." He paused. "You threw me a rope. And I don't care what Frank Voss or Vera Hutchins or the entire population of Harlan Creek calls it, that is what you did, and I will not let you sit here and call it a mistake." Eleanor's hands were tight on the table. Her jaw was working with something she was holding back, which was rare enough for her that it made his chest ache. "I sent him that letter," she said. "I provoked him." "He put his hands on you," Caleb said. "Don't do that. Don't turn that into something you caused." She closed her eyes, opened them. "I'm not afraid of Frank Voss." "I know you're not. I'm afraid of what he can do to the children." Her voice dropped. "To your children. If this gets ugly enough and long enough, they're the ones who suffer it. Abigail's already been asked about me at school. Thomas heard something cruel at the feed store last week, and I could see it on his face when he came home." She exhaled. "I won't be the reason your children are treated badly in their own town." The sentence landed like a stone. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "Is that what you're thinking?" he said. "That the answer is you leaving?" She didn't answer, which was its own answer. "Eleanor." He leaned forward. "If you walk away from this house because of Frank Voss, you're not protecting my children. You're giving that man exactly what he wants." He watched her face. "And you're taking something away from them that they didn't have before you came, and you'd be taking it because some drunk bully with a lawyer told you to." His jaw was tight. "Is that who you are?" The silence stretched. Then Eleanor sat up straighter. Something resettled in her spine. Something he recognized as the Eleanor Voss who had faced Vera Hutchins in Murdoch's store and told her to mind her own business without raising her voice. "No," she said. Quiet and absolute. "Good." "But we need a plan," she said immediately, because Eleanor Voss didn't do resolution without strategy. Because wishing Frank away didn't work, writing out to him didn't work, and writing him letters apparently turned him into a problem with legal representation. So, she put both palms flat. What do we actually do? What they did was go see Judge Harlan, not the next morning. That same evening, while Thomas stayed with the children, Caleb and Eleanor rode into town together for the first time together publicly side by side, and went to the house of Judge Amos Harlan, who had lived in this county for 30 years, and knew every inch of its land records and every family who'd ever tried to misuse them. The judge was on his porch with a pipe and a newspaper, and looked at the two of them coming up his walk with the particular expression of a man who has seen enough of human nature to be unsurprised by most of it. "Caleb Rourke," he said. "Eleanor Voss." He folded his paper. "I wondered when you'd show up." "You know about the lawyers," Caleb said. "I know everything that happens in this county, son. Sit down." They sat. Eleanor explained the situation with the efficiency and precision of a woman who'd once been a school teacher and knew how to organize information. Judge Harlan listened without interrupting, puffing his pipe at intervals, his eyes moving between them. When she finished, he tapped his pipe against the railing. "The deed is clean," he said. "Douglas Voss purchased that property outright from the Kellerman estate in 1871 and left it to Eleanor in his will, probated properly in this court. Frank Voss has no legal claim." He paused. "However." Caleb felt the however before it arrived. "Frank's been making noise in Carson City as well. And the men he's hired aren't nobody. They're going to make this expensive and slow, even if they can't make it successful, and slow and expensive is its own kind of winning if you're not careful." The judge looked at Eleanor. "You've got the savings to fight it." "I've committed a portion of my savings to another purpose," Eleanor said without looking at Caleb. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Then you need to think carefully about whether you're prepared for a protracted legal argument." He paused. "Or you need to think about whether there's a faster way to make Frank's case irrelevant." "What kind of faster way?" Caleb asked. Judge Harlan looked at him for a moment with an expression that managed to be completely neutral and entirely knowing at the same time. "The kind that changes your legal relationship to the property in question." He tapped his pipe again. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just a man who knows how the law works." He stood up. "Think about it. Come see me when you've thought." They rode home without speaking for almost a mile. Then Eleanor said to the road ahead of them, "He's suggesting we get married." "I know what he's suggesting." Silence. "That's not a plan," she said. "No," Caleb agreed. More silence, the kind that was full of things neither of them was ready to say in the dark on a road with half a mile still to go. "I'll contact my own lawyer in the morning," Eleanor said finally. "I have one in Carson City I've used before. A woman, actually. She's sharper than anyone Frank's hired, I can promise you that." "All right. And I think you should speak to Thomas. Tell him what's happening. He's old enough and he'll hear it worse from someone else." "I know." She looked at him sideways in the dark. "You're very quiet." "I'm thinking." "About what the judge said." He didn't answer right away. The horses moved easy beneath them, and the summer night was warm and full of crickets, and somewhere ahead, a lantern was burning in his kitchen window, where Thomas had left it lit. "Among other things," he said. Eleanor turned her face back to the road. They reached the house. Thomas appeared in the doorway looking relieved, which he covered immediately with a studied casualness that didn't fool anyone. Eleanor went inside to check on the sleeping children. Caleb saw to the horses. By the time he came back in, Eleanor had her coat on and was ready to leave. He walked her out to the mare. It was something he'd started doing without deciding to sometime in the second week, walking her out, seeing her off standing at the gate, until she was down the lane and turned onto the road. She untied the mare, turned to him. "Caleb?" She said his name differently than she used to. In the beginning, it had been careful, deliberate. Now it came out the way words do when they've found their own weight. "Whatever happens with Frank, I need you to know that I don't regret coming here." He looked at her in the dark. "Even with all of it. Especially with all of it." Something shifted in her face. I spent 4 years being very careful, very contained. I built a life that was manageable and safe and entirely mine, and I was... She paused. I was not happy. I was fine. There's a difference. She held his gaze. I'd forgotten the difference until... She stopped. Until what? He said quietly.
This story was posted on the
She
channel
looked at him
west
for a
of
long,
Betrayal.
suspended moment.
Please do not repost it.
Go
in
to
any
bed,
form.
Caleb, she said. But she said it gently, almost gently enough to be something else. She rode away. He stood at the gate until the dark swallowed her. Then he went inside and found Thomas still awake at the kitchen table. I need to tell you some things, Caleb said. Thomas looked at him steadily. I already know most of it. I figured you might. Caleb sat down. What don't you know? Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, what are you going to do about Mrs. Voss? I'm going to make sure Frank Voss can't hurt her. That's not what I mean, Thomas said. The boy's voice was careful the way it always was when he was about to say something that cost him. I mean, what are you going to do? About her. He met his father's eyes. Because you look at her the way you used to look at Mama. Not the same, it's not the same thing, but the same kind of thing. He paused. And she looks at you like she's waiting for you to notice that she looks at you. Caleb sat with that for a long moment. Thomas. I'm not upset about it, Thomas said, quickly like he needed to get it out before he changed his mind. I want you to know that. He stopped. Started again. At first I watched her because I was waiting for her to do something wrong. Some reason to not trust her. His jaw moved. She never did. She just kept showing up and doing the work and not asking for anything and being... He looked down at the table. Being good to all of us. And I kept watching and waiting, and she just kept being good. He looked up. So I'm not upset. I just want you to know that. Caleb's throat was very tight. She's not your mother, he said. I know that. Thomas's voice was steady. But she's... He seemed to search for the word. She's someone. She's a real someone. And we need a real someone. He pushed back from the table, stood up, and then he did something he hadn't done unprompted since he was about 10 years old. He put a hand briefly on his father's shoulder, firm and deliberate, and then took it back. Night, Pa. He went upstairs. His footsteps on the stairs were the footsteps of a boy becoming a man, and Caleb listened to them and felt 14 years of fatherhood compressed into his chest all at once. The crisis came at noon 3 days later. It didn't come from Frank Voss or his lawyers. It came from George. George, who had been quieter than usual for nearly a week, which Caleb had noticed and flagged mentally, but not acted on fast enough, had a confrontation at the creek with 2 older boys from town who had said something specific and cruel about Eleanor. Something they'd heard from their parents. Something that used words no 12-year-old should be deploying at a 7-year-old. George came home with a bloody nose and his fists still clenched. Eleanor was the one who found him. She heard the screen door bang and came from the kitchen and took one look at George and went straight to him. Not past him, straight to him, kneeling down in the hallway without hesitation. What happened? She said. Not a question. A door opened. George looked at her. His chin was doing the terrible wobble of a child trying to hold it together and failing. They said things. He got out. About who? He pressed his lips together. About you and Pa. His voice cracked on the last word. They said you weren't a decent woman. They said my pa was... He couldn't finish it. Eleanor's face was absolutely controlled. Her hands, one on each of George's shoulders, were completely steady. What did you do? She asked. I hit Danny Morse in the face, George said miserably. Did he fall down? A tiny pause. Yes, ma'am? Something moved across Eleanor's face that she managed to keep from being anything too obvious. Come here. She pulled him in, and George, 7 years old, and trying so hard to be tough, dissolved against her shoulder like a small building losing its last wall. She held him and didn't say it was fine, because it wasn't fine, and didn't say he shouldn't have hit Danny Morse, because she clearly wasn't entirely sorry he had, and didn't say any of the useless managing things people say to children in pain. She just held him. Caleb stood in the doorway and watched and felt something enormous and irreversible happen in his chest. The kind of thing that once it happens, you can't unhappen it, you can only decide what to do next. George pulled back, eventually wiped his face on his sleeve with the embarrassed efficiency of a boy who'd allowed himself more feeling than planned. "Mrs. Voss," he said. "Yes. Are you going to leave?" The question was raw and direct, the way children ask things without protection. "Because of what people are saying." Eleanor looked at him. "No," she said. "I am not. Promise." She was quiet for just a moment, the briefest, most honest hesitation. "I promise you," she said. George nodded, wiped his nose, squared his shoulders back up. "Okay," he said, and went upstairs, and they could hear him telling Ruth everything in the specific loud whisper children use when they think they're being quiet. Eleanor stood up, turned around, saw Caleb. He didn't know what his face was doing. He didn't try to manage it. Eleanor looked at him for a long, suspended moment. Then she said very quietly, "I meant it." "I know you did," he said. She held his gaze. Something between them that had been approaching for weeks was closer now. He could feel it, the way you feel a change in weather in your bones before you see it in the sky. He took a step toward her. She didn't step back. "Eleanor," he said. "Don't," she said. Not harshly. Carefully. "Not yet. Not like this. Not in the middle of all of it." Her eyes were very direct. "When you say what I think you're about to say, I need it to be because the time is right, not because things are falling apart, and you're reaching for something to hold." He stopped. He thought about it. He thought about what she deserved. "Fair," he said. She nodded. The moment settled. Then Abigail screamed from the backyard, the sharp alarmed kind, not the pretend kind, and both of them moved at the same time. Clara was face down in the yard, having tripped over the porch step, and the screaming turned out to be Abigail's reaction to scraped knees, rather than anything serious. And within 4 minutes, Clara was on Eleanor's lap, having her knees cleaned and bandaged, with a thoroughness and gentleness that made the girl stop crying entirely and start showing off her injuries with pride. But in those 4 minutes, Caleb had seen Eleanor run. Toward the sound of a child in distress, without thinking, without hesitation, just running the way a mother runs. And he understood in the quiet, certain way he understood most important things, that the question was not whether he had feelings for Eleanor Voss. The question was whether he had the right words for them, and whether she would let him say them when the time came. It was Thomas who told him about Frank Voss's next move. Thomas, who had ridden to town on an errand and come back at a hard canter, which was how Caleb knew before the boy even opened his mouth that something had shifted. "Frank's called a public meeting," Thomas said. He was breathing hard. "At the church hall, Saturday night, about the Voss property." He met his father's eyes. "He's invited half the county. He's going to make his case in public and let the town decide." Caleb looked at him. "He's bringing the lawyers," Thomas said. "And Caleb, he subpoenaed the bank records." The blood in Caleb's veins went very cold. Margaret's loan, Eleanor's repayment, all of it in black and white, being waved in front of every man and woman in Harlan Creek. Frank Voss hadn't come at Eleanor from one side. He'd been coming from all of them at once. Caleb told Eleanor that same evening, and he watched her face do something he'd never seen it do before, go completely blank. Not the composed, controlled stillness she used as armor. This was different. This was the blankness of a person absorbing a blow they hadn't seen coming. Then it cleared. And what replaced it was the kind of cold clarity he imagined she'd used to survive 4 years alone. "He subpoenaed the bank records," she said. "That's what Thomas heard. Which means he knows about the loan." She said it flatly, working through it. He knows I gave you money. He knows why. She was quiet for 1 second. He's going to stand up in front of the entire county and say I bought my way into your house. Eleanor, that's how he'll frame it. Her voice was even, precise. He won't say it crudely, his lawyers will dress
This
it up,
story was
but that is the
posted on the
story he's
channel
going to
west
tell
of
Saturday
Betrayal.
night.
Please do
That
not
I am a
repost
woman
it
of...
in any form.
She stopped, her jaw was tight. That I am not what people think I am. People who know you know better than that. People who know me, she said, are fewer than you think. I spent 4 years keeping to myself, and I did it on purpose, and right now I am deeply regretting that decision. She pushed back from the table, stood up, started moving, because Eleanor Voss couldn't sit still when she was thinking hard. If he puts those records in front of the county, the story writes itself. Widow loans money to struggling widower. Shows up at his house every day. Cooks for his children. People will decide what they want to decide, and no amount of explaining will undo it. Then we don't explain, Caleb said. She stopped moving, looked at him. We show up, he said. Saturday night, both of us. And we don't explain a single thing to Frank Voss or his lawyers. He held her gaze. We just tell the truth. All of it. Plainly. And we let the people in this town decide who they believe. That's a significant risk. Yes, he said. It is. She looked at him for a long moment. You're willing to do that. Stand up in front of everyone and... I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make sure that man doesn't win, Caleb said. And I'm willing to do it standing next to you. He paused. Question is whether you're willing to stand there with me. Eleanor Voss looked at him with those direct, measuring eyes, and then slowly she said, I'll need to send a telegram to Carson City tonight. To your lawyer. Yes. Something moved in her expression, not quite a smile, but the shape of one determined and sharp. If Frank wants a public proceeding, then let's make sure we bring the right people to it. The telegram went out that night. By Friday morning, Eleanor's lawyer, a woman named Catherine Marsh, who had a reputation in Carson City that preceded her, like weather had sent her reply. She would be on the noon stage. She would be ready. Friday was the longest day Caleb could remember since the week after Margaret died. The children felt the tension the way children always feel it in their bodies before they could name it. Clara was clingy. George picked a fight with Thomas over nothing. Abigail asked 4 times what was wrong and accepted none of the answers she received. Ruth, who understood more than anyone, was giving her credit for moved through the house with the quiet, deliberate helpfulness of someone trying to hold things steady through force of will. At supper time, Ruth set the table and then stood at the head of it and looked at Eleanor. Are we going to be all right? She asked. Direct. 11 years old and done with soft answers. Eleanor set down the serving dish, looked at Ruth without flinching. Yes, she said. How do you know? Because your father and I are not going to let Saturday's meeting be the end of the story, Eleanor said. And because I've been in harder spots than Frank Voss before. Ruth considered this. Have you? When I was 23, I stood in front of a school board of 9 men who didn't want a woman teaching their children, and I talked for 40 minutes until they hired me anyway. Eleanor met the girl's eyes. Frank Voss doesn't scare me, Ruth.
This story was
Losing
posted
you
on the
all
channel
scares
west
me.
of Betrayal.
He doesn't.
Please do not repost
Ruth
it in any
absorbed that.
form.
Then she sat down, picked up her fork, and said, Okay, with the tone of someone who has received the information she needed and is prepared to proceed. It was so completely Eleanor's manner that Caleb had to look at his plate to keep from showing what it did to him. After supper, after the little ones were in bed, Caleb found Thomas on the porch. I want to go Saturday, Thomas said before Caleb could speak. You're 14, son. I'm the man of this house when you're not in it. Thomas turned to face him. The porch lantern made him look older. I want to be there. I want Frank Voss to look at the oldest Rourke child and see that we're not ashamed and we're not afraid." Caleb looked at his boy for a long moment. "All right," he said. "You'll come." Thomas nodded. Then, "Is she going to stay? After Saturday, whatever happens, is she going to stay?" "I don't know," Caleb said. "I hope so." "Have you told her that?" "Not yet." Thomas looked at him with the particular exasperation of a young person watching an older person be unnecessarily slow about something obvious. "Pa, she promised George she wasn't leaving. She signed that loan agreement. She's been here every single day for 6 weeks." He crossed his arms. "How much more does she have to do before you tell her you want her to stay?" Caleb said nothing. "Tell her," Thomas said. He went inside. The screen door closed with a decisive click that felt like punctuation. Saturday morning, Catherine Marsh arrived. She was not what Caleb had pictured. He'd expected someone imposing severe, the kind of woman who wore her authority like armor. Instead, she was compact and quick-eyed, and looked at you like she was already 3 sentences ahead of whatever you were going to say. She shook Caleb's hand before he offered it, studied him for about 4 seconds, and turned to Eleanor. "He subpoenaed the loan documents," she said. "No greeting. I've already filed to quash it on privacy grounds. It won't succeed, but it'll slow him down." "We're not hiding the loan," Eleanor said. Catherine looked at her sharply. "Eleanor, I'm not walking into that meeting and looking like I have something to conceal." Her voice was final. "We tell it ourselves on our terms before he gets to frame it." A pause. Catherine looked at Caleb. "Is that your position too?" "It is," Caleb said. Catherine looked between them for a moment. Then she smiled, brief and sharp like a blade catching light. "All right then. Let's talk about how we tell it." They spent 3 hours at the kitchen table. Catherine asked questions that felt like they were coming from 6 different directions simultaneously, and Caleb answered every one of them straight, and Eleanor added what needed adding, and by noon, Catherine had a complete picture and a plan, and had covered 4 pages of notes with a handwriting so compact it was nearly a code. "There's something else you should know," Catherine said as she gathered her papers. She looked at Eleanor. "I've been doing some digging on the original Kellerman sale. The one Frank is claiming taints the deed." She paused. "Frank was present at the sale. He signed as a witness." The kitchen went very quiet. "He witnessed his own brother buying the land that he's now claiming Douglas had no right to buy," Eleanor said slowly. "Which means he perjures himself the moment he makes the claim in court," Catherine said. "He knows this. His lawyers almost certainly know this. Which means the lawsuit isn't the real weapon, it's the reputation damage. He's never going to win a lawsuit, but he might not need to." Caleb looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at Caleb. "Then Saturday night isn't a legal proceeding," Eleanor said. "It's a public smear." "Yes," Catherine said. "And we're going to walk in there and take it apart piece by piece in front of everyone he's invited to witness it." She closed her notebook. "Get some rest this afternoon. We're going to need to be sharp." The church hall was full when they arrived. Caleb had expected that. What he hadn't fully expected was the weight of it all, those faces turning the murmur that ran through the crowd the moment he walked in with Eleanor on one side and Thomas on the other, and Catherine Marsh coming right behind them like a woman with a purpose. He kept his chin level and his pace steady, and he looked at the people of Harlan Creek looking at him, and he didn't look away from a single one of them. Frank Voss was already at the front. He'd set up a table for his lawyers and himself, facing the room as if this were a trial, which Caleb supposed was the point. He looked up when Caleb came in, and something moved across his face, surprise quickly covered by the flat confidence of a man who thinks he holds all the cards. Judge Harlan was there too, off to the side, not presiding. This wasn't his proceeding, but present watching, which told Caleb that the judge had decided something and hadn't decided to share it yet. Vera Hutchins was in the 3rd row. Of course she was. Caleb and Eleanor sat in the front row facing Frank's table. Thomas sat next to his father, spine straight, jaw set. Margaret's eyes watchful and steady. Catherine Marsh sat beside Eleanor and opened her notebook. Frank's lead lawyer, a thin man named Aldrich, who spoke with the careful precision of someone who billed for every syllable, stood and explained the purpose
This
of the
story was
gathering.
posted on the channel
The
west
Voss
of
property.
Betrayal.
The
Please
question
do not
of rightful
repost
ownership.
it in any form.
The circumstances that made a review necessary. He was good at it, Caleb admitted. Good at making something ugly sound like reasonable civic concern. Then Frank stood up. And Frank was not good at it the way his lawyer was. Frank was blunt and angry underneath the careful framing, and it showed in the way his voice thickened when he got to Eleanor, in the way his eyes went to her with something that was not righteous concern, and several people in the room shifted in their seats at the sight of it. He told the story of the loan. He had the figures. He had the dates. He presented it with the implication hanging in the air. What kind of woman loans a man money? He let the room fill in the rest. And then Eleanor stood up. She didn't wait to be recognized. She didn't ask permission. She simply stood and the room went quiet, because Eleanor Voss standing up and opening her mouth had a gravity to it that commanded attention without asking for it. The loan, she said clearly, was made because Margaret Rourke spent the last 2 years of her life secretly borrowing against her own property to cover the medical costs of her youngest daughter's first year of life. She did it quietly to protect her husband the way women have always done things quietly, to protect the people they love. She let that land. When Mr. Rourke discovered this debt after his wife's death, he was facing foreclosure on the east pasture, which would have cost him a third of his grazing capacity and likely the farm itself. I loaned him the money because he is my neighbor, because his children are children I have come to care about, and because it was the right thing to do. She looked around the room. I have a signed repayment agreement. Terms clearly stated, money properly documented. There is nothing hidden and nothing shameful in this transaction. And if anyone in this room would like to see the paperwork, they are welcome to. Silence. Furthermore, Eleanor said, turning to face Frank directly, I would like to ask Mr. Frank Voss a question since we are all here gathering information. She did not raise her voice. Would Mr. Voss be willing to tell this room when he first set foot on the Kellerman property he's claiming his brother had no right to purchase? Frank's face went very still. Because I have a document, Eleanor said, signed by Frank Harold Voss, dated August 14, 1871, in which he witnessed the sale of that property from the Kellerman estate to his brother Douglas, as a legal witness. She looked at him. Which means either Mr. Voss believed at the time that the sale was legitimate, in which case his current claim is without basis, or he committed fraud by witnessing a sale he knew to be invalid. A pause. Either way, this room deserves to know which it is. Catherine Marsh set a copy of the document on the table in front of Frank's lawyers with the efficiency of a woman who has done this before and enjoyed it. Frank Voss opened his mouth. Closed it. His lead lawyer put a hand on his arm and leaned in, and whatever he said made Frank's face go from red to a different, uglier color. Judge Harlan, from his chair on the side, cleared his throat. I believe, he said mildly, that this meeting has produced the information it was intended to produce. He looked at Frank's table. Mr. Aldrich, I'd encourage you to have a frank, if you'll pardon the word, conversation with your client about the wisdom of proceeding. The room stirred. Not the hostile stirring of a crowd that had found their target something different. The shifting of people who had come expecting one thing and were leaving with another. Vera Hutchins in the third row said nothing at all, which for Vera was almost eloquent.
In any form.
Frank Voss stood up so abruptly his chair scraped. He pointed at Eleanor, the finger of a man who has run out of arguments and is falling back on anger. You think you've won something tonight? He said low and hard. You think this is over? I think, Eleanor said with complete calm, that you should leave this room, Frank, before you say something that gives me cause to involve the sheriff as well as my lawyer. Frank looked at Caleb. The look was a threat and a question, and a statement of something he hadn't given up on all at once. Caleb stood up. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He stood up, and he looked at Frank Voss, the way a man looks at something he has decided is no longer a problem worth explaining, and Frank Voss, for the first time since this started, looked at Caleb Rourke and took a step backward. He left. His lawyers followed the way lawyers do when the situation has turned against them efficiently and without drama. The room breathed. Thomas put his hand on his father's arm briefly, the gesture he'd used on the porch that night, firm and deliberate, and gone before anyone could make too much of it. Caleb pressed his own hand over his son's for just a moment. Jim Pratt came forward from 3 rows back, old Jim, who'd squeezed Caleb's shoulder at Margaret's grave, and said, "Well, that was something." He looked at Eleanor. "Mrs. Voss, you ever need a character witness in this county, you come find me." 2 other men said similar things. Mary Calhoun, who had 7 children of her own and had never been warm to Eleanor, but had also never been deliberately unkind, came up and said quietly, "What you said about Margaret, about doing things quietly to protect people." She stopped. That was right. That was right and true. She patted Eleanor's hand once and moved away. Even Murdoch, who was standing near the back with his arms crossed in the non-committal way of a man who'd been waiting to see how things went, gave a single nod in Caleb's direction that communicated more than a speech would have. Catherine Marsh was already repacking her notebook. "The lawsuit will be dropped by Monday," she said to Eleanor. "Aldrich knows what that witness signature means. They'll file a withdrawal and Frank will go back to wherever he came from and drink about it." She looked up. "You did well tonight." "We did well," Eleanor said. Catherine glanced at Caleb, then back at Eleanor. "Yes," she said with the particular smile of a woman who notices things and approves of what she notices. "You did." They rode home in the dark. The 3 of them, Caleb and Eleanor and Thomas, fell asleep in the wagon bed before they were half a mile out, which at any other time would have made Caleb smile, and only made him smile a little now, because the rest of his attention was somewhere else. He pulled the wagon to a stop at Eleanor's lane. Thomas slept on because Thomas had apparently decided this was the appropriate moment to be inconveniently unconscious. Eleanor climbed down. She stood by the mare, one hand on the bridle. The summer dark was warm around them, and the stars were the kind of stars you only get this far from town, and Caleb got down from the wagon and came to stand near her. "Eleanor," he said. "Caleb." She turned to face him. "I'm going to say something," he said, "and I need you to let me finish before you tell me I'm being premature or impractical." She was very still. "All right." He took a breath. "I know it hasn't been long. I know there are people who'll say it's too soon, and I know you've got reasons of your own to be careful. And I am not asking you to do anything tonight or tomorrow or next week. I'm not asking you for a decision." He held her gaze. "But I need you to know, because you deserve to know it plainly, that what I feel for you is not gratitude, and it is not convenience, and it is not me reaching for something to hold in the dark. It's more than that. And it's been more than that for a while now." He paused. "You walked into my house with pot roast and a matter-of-fact manner, and you put my family back together, and somewhere in the middle of watching you do it, I stopped being a man who was just surviving and started being a man who was looking forward to mornings again." He stopped. "That's because of you, and I needed you to hear it said straight." Eleanor looked at him for a long, complete silence. "That was straight," she said finally. Her voice was not quite steady. "I know it is," he said. "I meant every word." She looked down for a moment, then back up. "I told you once I'd forgotten the difference between being fine and being happy." She paused. "I've been remembering it, these past weeks. The difference." She met his eyes. "I think you should know that." "I'm glad," he said quietly. "I'm not making any decisions tonight," she said. "I meant that. This has been—" She exhaled. "It's been a great deal of evening." "It has," he agreed. "But—" She reached out and put one hand briefly against his arm the way she did with the children when she wanted them to understand something she couldn't quite say. A contact that was warm and deliberate and over before you could mistake it for something it wasn't ready to be yet. Don't stop saying those things, Caleb, that's all. Don't stop. He looked at her hand, looked at her face. I won't, he said. She nodded once, mounted the mare, looked down at him in the dark. Tell Clara I'll bring the lavender soap tomorrow, she said. She'll be very pleased. Good night, Caleb. Good night, Eleanor. She rode down her lane. He stood and watched the dark take her the same way he'd done every evening for 6 weeks, and this time it felt different. Not the ache of watching someone leave, but something closer to the knowledge that she was going to come back. That she'd been coming back. That she intended to keep coming back, not because of terms or agreements or practical necessity, but because she'd made a promise to a 7-year-old boy, with his fists clenched in the hallway, and Eleanor Voss, once she made a promise, did not break it. He climbed back up to the wagon. Thomas was still asleep, head on his arm, all the studied adulthood of him dissolved in the uncomplicated honesty of a boy who was tired. Caleb drove home through the summer dark. In the morning, Eleanor arrived before breakfast, the way she always did now, and Clara was at the door before the mare had fully stopped calling her name in the high certain voice of a child who has decided someone belongs to her. Eleanor swung down and caught the girl in one motion, lifting her without effort, and Clara wrapped both arms around her neck and announced that she'd had a dream about lavender and was it breakfast time yet. Ruth came to the door and looked at Eleanor with those clear, steady eyes that saw everything and said simply, "You came back." "I came back," Eleanor said. Ruth nodded, held the door open, let her in. George was at the table already, and he looked up when Eleanor came in carrying Clara on her hip, and the relief on his 7-year-old face was so complete and unguarded that Eleanor had to look away for a moment to the window to compose herself. Abigail was beside Eleanor before she'd put Clara down, talking immediately about something she'd read and something she'd wondered about, and something Ruth had said that she disagreed with, and Eleanor listened to all 3 things simultaneously, with the attention of a woman who had once managed 30 children at once, and found 5 entirely manageable. Thomas came downstairs last. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at his father. He pulled out his chair, sat down, and said, "Pass the biscuits," which was as close to a blessing as this family was going to offer, and it was enough. Caleb sat at the head of his table and listened to his house full of noise. Clara demanding Eleanor's opinion on something, Abigail correcting George Thomas, eating with the focused efficiency of a boy who'd been doing hard things, Ruth asking Eleanor about the meeting with the quiet directness she'd inherited from no one and developed entirely on her own. He listened to Eleanor's voice moving through all of it steady and warm and real, and he thought about Margaret, and he let himself think about her the way he'd started to with love, and without the jagged edge of it. Because grief finds its shape eventually, if you're honest enough to let it. He thought about what Margaret had done. Carrying debt alone so Clara could live. Protecting him the way she always had. He thought about the specific kind of love that does hard things quietly and asks for nothing back. And he thought about how he'd found that same quality again in a woman who brought pot roast to strangers and signed her name on a loan agreement she'd never needed to sign, and made a promise to a child, and kept it, and kept it, and kept it. The summer was not over. There would be a harvest to manage, and a debt to repay, and Frank Voss would slink back to wherever shame took men, when public proceedings went against them, and Eleanor's lawyer would get a letter on Monday, and life would do the complicated thing it always does. Pile up demand, surprise you, break you a little, and build you back differently. But at this table on this morning, there were 5 children eating breakfast with a woman who had chosen them as deliberately as anyone had ever chosen anything, and a man who had stopped going under and started going forward, and the particular warmth of a house that has found its own heartbeat again. Clara climbed off her chair and into Eleanor's lap without asking, the way she always did, now settling herself with the absolute confidence of a child who knows exactly where she belongs. Eleanor put one arm around her, picked up her coffee with the other hand, and went right on talking to Ruth without missing a beat. Caleb watched her. She looked up and caught him watching the way she always caught him, and for just a moment, something moved between them, across the kitchen table, acknowledged and unhurried, and belonging entirely to the two of them. Then Abigail knocked over her milk and everyone moved at once, and the morning poured on around them, the way mornings do when they're full of people who matter to each other. Some things don't arrive with ceremony. They arrive like this in the ordinary middle of an ordinary morning, in a house that was broken and found its way back around a table where every seat is filled, and nobody is counting the empty ones anymore. They had started as a desperate arrangement between neighbors. They had become something that didn't need a name, because the name didn't matter. What mattered was that it was real, and it was chosen. And every single day, Eleanor Voss rode down that lane and came through that door. And every single day that was enough to build a life on.